It was a bleak December evening, the kind where the cold digs deep into your bones and everything around you feels like it's covered in a layer of frost. The sky was dark by 5 p.m., and the wind whistled through the cracks of the old, forgotten motel on the edge of town where I worked. Most people don't notice it when they pass by. The sign flickers on and off, and the building itself looks more like an abandoned shack than a place to rest. But it's cheap, and for some travelers, it's a last resort. It's where I ended up too. I had been working there for a few months, not really because I wanted to, but because life had pushed me in that direction. You know how it is. Sometimes you end up in places you never thought you'd be, doing things you never imagined. It was quiet though, and I liked that. The few guests who came through were always in a hurry to leave, so they never caused much trouble. But something about that night was different. Maybe it was the way the wind howled through the trees, or maybe it was the fact that there were so few guests. The motel had an eerie stillness to it, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The small family that checked in that evening seemed normal enough. I remember them clearly because they were one of the few who actually smiled at me. The parents were young, probably in their late 20s or early 30s, and their little girl was a bundle of energy, bouncing up and down with excitement as they walked to their room. She had big brown eyes that sparkled with curiosity and curly hair that bounced with every step she took. They had booked a room for 3 nights, and everything seemed fine at first. I cleaned their room the next morning while they were out exploring the town. The little girl had left her doll on the bed, its arms stretched wide open like it was waiting for a hug. It was one of those moments that made me smile. The parents had left the room tidy, and the mother had even left me a small tip with a note that said, "Thank you." It wasn't often that guests went out of their way to acknowledge the staff, and it made me feel good, even if just for a moment. That night, though, something terrible happened. I remember waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of screaming. At first I thought I was dreaming. The sound was muffled, like it was coming from far away. But as I blinked myself awake, I realized the screams were real, and they were close, too close. I jumped out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest, and threw on a jacket. The sound was coming from down the hall, near the room where the family was staying. I ran down the corridor, my footsteps echoing against the walls. My mind raced with questions. Was someone hurt? Was there an intruder? When I reached the door, the sight that greeted me sent a chill down my spine. The mother was standing in the middle of the room, her face pale and twisted with terror, her hands clutching at her hair. She was screaming, a sound so raw and primal that it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The father was beside her, his face a mask of confusion and fear. They were tearing through the room, ripping open drawers, throwing back the blankets, searching everywhere with a frantic energy that bordered on hysteria. Their daughter, the little girl with the curly hair and bright eyes, was gone. I could feel my stomach drop as I took in the scene. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in my throat. How could a child just disappear? 1 minute she was here, and the next, nothing. Other guests had started to gather in the hallway, their faces filled with concern and confusion. Someone must have called the police because within minutes the sound of sirens filled the air, and the red and blue lights flashed through the thin curtains of the motel windows. The officers moved quickly, interviewing the parents, combing through the room, and spreading out to search the surrounding area. They asked me if I had seen anything unusual, but I hadn't. Everything had seemed normal, right up until the moment the girl was gone. As the hours dragged on, the tension in the air grew thicker. The mother was sobbing uncontrollably, and the father stood by the door, his face pale, his eyes empty. It was like he was in shock, unable to process what had happened. I could feel their panic, their desperation, and it gnawed at me. How could a child just vanish without a trace? That's when I remembered Steve. Steve had been working at the motel for about a month. He was quiet, kept to himself, and always seemed a little off. There was something about him that didn't sit right with me, but I couldn't put my finger on it. He didn't talk much, and when he did, it was always in short, clipped sentences. I had tried to be friendly with him at first, but he always seemed to avoid eye contact, like he didn't want to be noticed. Now, I couldn't shake the feeling that Steve had something to do with this. I told one of the officers about Steve, and they immediately asked to see the security footage from the motel's cameras. It took a while for the old system to pull up the footage, but when it finally did, my heart sank. There he was, Steve, slipping into the family's room in the middle of the night. The timestamp showed it was just after 1:30 a.m. He moved quietly, like he knew exactly what he was doing. A few minutes later, he emerged, carrying something, a rolled-up mat. At first, it looked like he was just taking out some trash, but as the mat unfurled slightly, we all saw it, the tiny, lifeless legs of a child sticking out. The mother let out a wail that echoed through the halls, and the father's face drained of all color. It was one of those moments that will stay with me forever, the kind that etches itself into your memory and never lets go. The police wasted no time. They mobilized a search party, spreading out into the woods that surrounded the motel. Flashlights cut through the darkness, and the sound of barking dogs filled the air as they scoured the area, looking for any sign of Steve or the little girl. Hours passed and the tension grew unbearable. The parents were beside themselves with grief, clutching each other as they waited for any news. I stayed in the lobby, watching the clock tick by, every minute feeling like an eternity. Then, just as dawn was breaking, the call came in. They had found Steve. He was deep in the woods, standing in a small clearing, holding the little girl in his arms. She was limp, her eyes closed, her body still. Steve was talking to someone, though there was no one else around. The officers later told me that he was speaking in a low, whispery voice, as if he was having a conversation with someone only he could see. When the police approached, Steve didn't resist. He simply handed the girl over, his face blank and emotionless, like he didn't care about what he had done. The little girl was alive, but barely. She was rushed to the hospital, and the doctors said she would recover physically, but emotionally, that was another story. As for Steve, he was taken into custody. I never saw him again after that night, but the motel was never the same. The parents left town the next day, and the rooms that had once been filled with laughter and life now felt hollow and cold. I still work at the motel, but the memory of that night haunts me. Every time I walk past the room where the little girl disappeared, I can feel a chill run down my spine. The walls whisper with secrets I'll never understand, and sometimes late at night, I can still hear the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway, like someone's watching, waiting. It was November 2020, and Daniel and I were coming off one of the most peaceful trips we'd ever taken. We had just spent a week camping in the remote wilderness of Alaska, miles away from any civilization, just the two of us and the vast, untouched landscape. The air was crisp, the sky a never-ending stretch of deep blue during the day and filled with stars at night. We spent our days hiking, cooking over campfires, and sleeping under thick blankets to fend off the biting cold. But as serene as it was, by the end of the trip, we were ready for the comforts of modern life again. Hot showers, a warm bed, and a solid roof over our heads. Our flight back to the city was scheduled for the next morning, so we decided to stay at a motel we found along the highway. It wasn't much to look at, just a small, weathered building surrounded by tall trees, the neon sign out front flickering like it was about to give up any minute. But it was late, and we were exhausted. We didn't have the energy to be picky. We pulled into the parking lot, and I remember feeling an odd sense of isolation. The wind was howling, bending the tops of the P. As the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us back from that motel. It wasn't just the odd encounter with the housekeeping women or the strange noises we had heard the night before. It was more than that. There was something about that room, something about the atmosphere that stayed with me, even as we left the place behind. At first, Daniel and I tried to brush it off as a strange coincidence, chalking up the oddities to exhaustion or the isolated location of the motel. But as the days turned into weeks, the feeling grew stronger. At night, I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, convinced I heard whispers just beyond my reach. The kind of whispers that weren't real, but felt just real enough to make you question your own sanity. One evening, as we sat in our apartment in the city, I noticed something strange on my phone. A photo, one I didn't recognize. It was a picture of the door to the room we had stayed in. The door, the very same one I had opened and closed without thinking twice. But the image was wrong. There was a shadow in the frame, a dark silhouette that stood in the doorway, as if someone or something had been watching me when I took the photo. I could feel my heart racing as I stared at the image. How had it gotten there? I didn't remember taking it, and I certainly hadn't sent it to myself. The picture had the same strange lighting, that eerie, distorted quality that made the room look even more off-kilter than it had been in real life. "Daniel, look at this," I said, my voice trembling slightly as I handed him the phone. He glanced at it, his eyes narrowing. "That's from the motel, right?" he asked. I nodded, still feeling a cold chill creeping over me. "It's the door, but I don't remember taking it." Daniel stayed quiet for a moment, and then his eyes widened. "You don't think the room followed us, do you?" I didn't want to believe it, but the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like the only explanation. The whispers, the shadows, the odd feeling I'd had in that room. There was something wrong with it, something we couldn't see or explain. And now it seemed like that darkness had come with us. That night, as we lay in bed, I heard it again. A whisper, soft but unmistakable. It came from the corner of the room, just beyond my sight. I held my breath, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then the whisper came again, clearer this time, almost as if someone was standing right beside me. "Leave," the voice whispered, low and urgent. I jumped out of bed, my heart racing. Daniel stirred beside me, mumbling something in his sleep. But I was wide awake now, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, scanning the room. But there was nothing there. The whispers continued for days, growing louder, more insistent, until I couldn't take it anymore. I called the motel, hoping to find some sort of explanation, some way to put my mind at ease. The phone rang for what felt like an eternity before someone picked up. "This is room 7 motel," a voice answered, gravelly and disinterested. It was the same elderly man I had seen when we checked out. "Hi, I stayed there recently, and I think there's something wrong with the room. Something strange happened," I explained, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a long pause on the other end. Then finally, the man spoke. "We've had guests complain about room 7 before," he said, his tone flat, almost bored. "But it's nothing to worry about. The building's old, you know. Sometimes people get a little spooked. It happens." "But it's not just that," I insisted. "There's something in that room, something that followed us. I need to know what happened there." The man was silent for a long time, and just as I was about to say something else, he spoke again. "Maybe you should never have stayed there," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "But now that you have, there's nothing to be done. It's too late." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stared at my phone, my hands shaking. What had he meant by that? Too late? I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread, like whatever had been haunting that room wasn't going to let us go. The whispers continued to plague me, and as the weeks went by, the shadows grew longer in the corners of the room. I couldn't escape it. And worse, I began to notice strange things around me. Objects in my apartment moved when I wasn't looking. Lights flickered even when they were off. And sometimes, when I was alone, I would feel a cold breath against my neck. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to return to the motel, to confront whatever it was that had attached itself to us. Daniel was hesitant, but I insisted. I had to know what was happening. I couldn't live in fear anymore. When we arrived, the motel was just as we remembered, silent and dark, the sign flickering in the distance. The door to room 7 was locked when we arrived, and no one was around to help us. It felt like the whole place was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I took the keys and walked up to the door. As my hand touched the doorknob, I heard it again. The whisper, faint but clear, "Leave." I ignored it. This time I was determined to face whatever was inside. With one quick motion, I opened the door. What I saw made my blood run cold. The room was just as it had been when we first stayed there, but there was something new, something that hadn't been there before. On the far wall, a dark stain spread across the paint, almost like a shadow that refused to be washed away. And there, in the corner, stood a door that hadn't been there before, an old wooden door with a faded brass handle. The whispers seemed to emanate from behind it, and my hand instinctively reached for the handle. Just as my fingers brushed against it, Daniel pulled me back, his face pale. "Don't open it," he whispered, his voice shaky. "We need to go, now." But it was too late. The door creaked open by itself, revealing a long, dark hallway stretching far beyond my sight. And at the end of that hallway stood something I couldn't explain. A figure, tall and thin, with glowing eyes that watched us from the darkness. Before we could react, the door slammed shut, locking itself with an eerie finality. And as I turned to Daniel, I saw the fear in his eyes, the same fear I felt deep inside. Whatever was in that motel had no intention of letting us leave. It was the summer of 2015 when I first moved into the old house on Maple Street. It wasn't my first choice, but I'd been in the city for a while and couldn't find anything better. The house was cheap for the size, and the owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Abernathy, was nice enough to give me a deal. The house was large, maybe too large for one person, but that was part of its charm. It had high ceilings, large windows, and wood floors that creaked underfoot. It was the kind of place that felt like it had a history, even though I wasn't sure what kind. At first, everything seemed fine. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, and the house was just far enough from the hustle and bustle of the city to feel isolated. It was a place where I could think, get away from everything, and start fresh. But as time passed, I started to notice strange things. Little things at first. The way the lights would flicker occasionally, or how the air would feel different in certain rooms, colder in some places, warmer in others. I shrugged it off. Old houses were like that, right? The real problem began one evening in the dead of winter. I had just finished making dinner and was settling in to watch a movie when I heard it. A soft tapping noise coming from somewhere within the walls. I paused the movie, confused. It wasn't a sound I'd ever heard before. Too rhythmic to be the house settling, too consistent to be anything normal. I sat there for a few minutes, listening, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It seemed to be coming from the walls near the living room, just above the fireplace. I assumed it was just some animal, maybe a squirrel or a raccoon, trapped in the walls, but it wasn't the usual scrabbling or scratching you'd expect. This was different. The tapping had a pattern to it, like someone was knocking softly, almost like a message. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stood up, moving cautiously towards the wall. The sound stopped as soon as I got close, and I stood there, holding my breath, hoping to hear it again. Nothing. I shrugged it off, thinking it was my imagination. That night, I didn't sleep well. The tapping started again, louder this time, and it came in the middle of the night. It was as if whatever was inside the walls was trying to get my attention. I tried to ignore it, but the sound grew more insistent, almost as if it was calling me. I couldn't take it anymore. The next day I called a handyman to come take a look. He checked the walls, the pipes, and the attic, but couldn't find anything that could explain the tapping. Everything seemed normal. He told me it was probably just the house settling and left it at that. But the tapping didn't stop. It continued for days, every night at the same time, around midnight. I started to lose sleep, becoming more and more agitated as the sound grew louder. It was as though it was right next to me, echoing through the house, and every night it would stop the moment I got up to investigate. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was making the sound. One night, I decided to stay up, determined to catch whatever it was. I stayed in the living room, my eyes glued to the wall where the tapping usually came from. Around midnight, it started again. Soft at first, just like before. But this time, I was ready. I rushed to the wall, and to my shock, the tapping stopped immediately. I put my ear against the wall, trying to hear anything out of the ordinary. It was completely silent. But then something worse happened. I felt something on the other side of the wall. A hand pressing against the surface. Not a physical hand, but the unmistakable feeling of something there, just out of reach. The wall seemed to pulse, and a whisper, too soft to understand, came from within. I recoiled, heart pounding. I didn't know what it was, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't something I could explain away. It was real, and it was trying to get my attention. I didn't sleep that night. The tapping didn't stop. and neither did the feeling of something pressing against the wall.